Hello and good afternoon, everyone. So obviously I'm still Elke from Edinburgh University, and we have today a pre-organized panel with three speakers. They are going to talk to us about experimentation in 21st century period drama. And the three papers are by Julie Taddeo, Katherine Byrne, and James Ward. And do you know what? The three of them have been working together on and off. Well, Katherine and Julie are basically a powerhouse in publication on period drama, which I have benefited from as well, I have to admit. So they have published me before, and they've just published a book on rape in period drama, which I would really highly recommend to anyone. It's a very nuanced and very interesting book on all the complexities of rape in period drama. But because you've worked together so much, I think the best way to do it is I'm just going to hand over to the first speaker, who is, sorry, I'm a little bit disorganized, Katherine.
Hello, I'm hoping that is coming up okay.
Yes.
That's great. And I'll just make it a slideshow. Okay, that should be me. Okay, hello everybody. I must apologize in advance because this is a kind of a start of a project for me, so it's very kind of provisional. It's not something that I've worked out properly, so I'd be very grateful for any feedback or kind of information that I'm, should be missing. So I've changed slightly from my abstract because I ended up just thinking so much about these couple of adaptations of Agatha Christie that I'm not really going to say much about High Seas, and I'm apologising to Julie in particular because I know she's a big High Seas fan, and I won't really get onto it very much today, but I've got kind of obsessed with Christie in lots of ways recently. So this is kind of the focus today. So what I'm talking about then are these particular adaptations of Agatha Christie, which have been quite recent, and hopefully many of you will have seen them on BBC or on Amazon. And really the point about them is that they rework and they do interesting things with a genre that, as you all know, has been around for a very long time. I won't bore you with all, unless you're a fan, in which case you know this already. I won't bore you with all the Agatha Christie facts and figures, but obviously she is the biggest crime writer in the world, even still. And countless adaptations have already taken place of her work. So these, I'm picking out a very small number of a huge lot of opportunities that could be talked about and have been written about in the past. And I'm not going to touch even on the Kenneth Branagh films because they're film rather than television. So I'm doing particularly the Sarah Phelps adaptations, which were on recently on British television. So she herself adapted her work for the stage, her famous play, The Mousetrap. So she was interested herself in the process of adaptation. I want to say The Mousetrap. Any of you Toast of London fans will know what I'm talking about there. But so anyway, the cozy detective novel, I mean, I apologize if this is very familiar to some of you, but as a literature student, this is the obvious place to start for me. And I teach Agatha Christie to my undergrads, and actually a few of them have taken her on board and been so interested in her recently that this has sort of inspired this new project that I'm working on or just begun. Usually I just moan about teaching getting in the way of research, but in this way it actually has really contributed. So the kind of concept, again, apologies if this is really familiar, but the concept of the kind of cozy mystery, which is really middle class. They're often set in the countryside or they're set in a stately home. You can see already how they're just perfect for period drama and that kind of adaptation. But of course, it starts really in the early 20th century. And the significant thing I think about them from a sort of social critique point of view is that we often we're encouraged to identify the people investigating the crime, not the victim of the crime. And there's real issues already, kind of thinking about that. And I know we're all very familiar with watching crime fiction on TV, and you can see that this is something that's reworked with modern noir and Scandi noir and those kinds of things as well. But this in this type of fiction, detective fiction, we're not really encouraged to feel pity or kind of think even that much about the body. Instead, we're thinking about the whole thing as a problem, an intellectual problem. And that's why this was such a popular escapist type of fiction, why it was a real guilty pleasure for lots of readers, and why it was the kind of literature that offered you, you know, a kind of escape from ordinary life, particularly in a post-war 20th century post-war context. And certainly we could all do with some escape from ordinary life at the moment, but that doesn't happen on television in the same way. We aren't really, in these dramas that I'm going to talk about today, we don't really have this sense of, you know, we're just thinking about Poirot and not the person under, the person who's been killed. We have to grieve and suffer and feel in a way we didn't in the source text. They're usually, though, again, this is familiar, I know, but they're usually set around a particular group of people, and you're kind of all looking at each other with paranoid expectation because only one of you in this closed room mystery is responsible for killing the victim. And they, of course, as you can imagine, are these cozy mysteries are obsessed with psychology and normality and criminality and things like that. And that was a relatively new science in the early 20th century. And the significant thing about them quite frequently, and I will get to the TV in a second, but the significant thing is that it's rarely an outsider or an other who is the murderer. It's always someone who's at the heart of the story. And they're usually very sane and self-interested. They're not, you know, the crazy serial killer in these cozy mysteries. It's someone who is, you know, benefiting themselves for their own reasons, very sane reasons. They're committing these crimes. So there's loads of these novels. If you either love them, I think, or you don't, they're pretty divisive in lots of ways, not just because of their social class and race problems, as they often identify, we can often identify in them. So if you're a fan already of Christie, you won't need convincing. But for me, she is a kind of just going back to this idea of her guilty pleasure, because she is dubious in a lot of ways in terms of her representation of race in particular. So it's interesting then to see her as someone who's been really reclaimed and reworked in really, and that's the whole point of my paper today, exciting new ways by recent film and TV adaptations. And as I said, the ones I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes are Sarah Phelps's recent TV version. And she's done quite a few of these, and I didn't have time to talk about them. I don't have time to talk about them all. I don't want to be hogging things that James and Julie's time later. So I'm only going to focus on the ABC murders with John Malkovich there on the left, and on Ordeal by Innocence, which is second from the right there, where there's others starring. It's always nice to see Aidan Turner, but there's starring Aidan Turner there as well. And you know, so she's done quite a few, I think, starting around 2016. So over the last 8 years, these have been produced regularly at Christmas in particular, and that's ones you may have watched in your Christmas viewing. And so here's Phelps kind of showing us why she has chosen to adapt Christie, because she is she's not the kind of conservative writer that we might expect to be following Christie in many ways. She is a kind of quite an outspoken left-wing writer. So she's drawn almost despite Christie's reputation. I suppose that's why I like it as well. But she's suggesting, in true adaptation scholarship fashion, she's suggesting there's a real tension between the book Christie wants people to read, that she needs to present a certain kind of mystery, a formula, very familiar characters in many ways, or alternatively, she's not a character that much at all. There's a real tension there between the book she wants people to read, that she wants people to buy, that she will produce in huge quantities, and the book she actually wants to write. And I always think, this is Phelps is talking, when I'm reading, what's that doing there? Is it a mistake? Is it a lapse in concentration? Did she mean for it to be there? I think it's a clue. They give you an undercurrent of a very different story. And when I follow those clues, I come up with my version. So I like this idea of, Christie herself writing a detective story within a detective story with hints and undercurrents, conscious or not, that hint at all those things that she'd like to say but can't. And so this is kind of the basis for what Phelps has done in these adaptations, because they do actually play very fast and loose with the source text. And sometimes these work, and obviously I enjoyed them, or I wouldn't be thinking about them in this way today. And sometimes for some critics, they really don't. Rachel Cook, writing, I think, in The Atlantic here, says Phelps' version of Christie Land, you know, we're also familiar with these stories and with the setting that they occupy, is ostentatiously, real, with all manner of nastiness to be found in the crevices of a class system that is unscalable as a high garden wall. But she wants, or perhaps she knows that her audience wants, its old coziness too, the tea sets, the twin sets, the social upsets. The result is, to me, cartoony. And so some of these versions of things like The Pale Horse, there on the right, the most recent version, some of them are kind of less successful for viewers than others, but all of them change elements, quite substantial elements of the core text. And for me, they do that in really interesting ways. Okay, so the two I'm going to talk about today, the first one is The ABC Murders, as I said, starring John Malkovich. There he is on the right. Hopefully you can see that okay. And that was from 2018. And they usually do feature big stars, as you can imagine. They attract big stars. This is really messes around with the concept of Poirot, because it's preoccupied with growing older anyway. And it shows us this kind of aging, retire, unloved Poirot, played by Malkovich, in a much less, you know, kind of over the top manner than Kenneth Branagh does in the movies, the recent movies. And he is victimized in this adaptation set in the 30s because of the rise of fascism he's living in London at this time. And you can see him constantly being kind of abused by lots of people because of their xenophobic attitudes towards him as someone who's emigrated to the UK. And this is an interesting story, it's an interesting source text. Anyway, The ABC Murders, because it isn't set in one place, it isn't set in one family, it's not enclosed, it's not a locked room mystery. Instead, we move around different parts, little random, often unknown small towns in Britain, and the murders take place in each of them. And I won't go into huge details about the plot. You don't need to have read it or know about it. But that is obviously an unusual feature of Christie's work. And it also looks like it's a serial killer who's killing, you know, random victims just for pleasure. And of course, because it's Christie, it's not as simple as that. And I've noticed there's the kind of trend in adaptation studies of popular text recently. The same was true of Dracula that came out a couple of years ago. In the books, they're always kind of, there's a team and there's a buddy system and they're all helping each other and working together. Here we have these adaptations kind of marked by isolation, because Poirot's, if you read the books, you'll know he's got a sidekick called Captain Hastings. Poirot's sidekick is nowhere to be seen. He's got no friends. He's kind of seen constantly alone. And there's this sort of bleak, you know, attitude that we're all alone nowadays, that this is what modernity is. And that's completely changed from the original text of lots of these books. I mentioned Dracula because it's the same. There's a team in Dracula and they're all kind of separate in the recent BBC adaptation of that novel as well. And of course, it's a bit more, it's trying to be gritty and realistic. And the fact that Poirot is really viewed with suspicion by the police. They don't want his help. They don't trust him. And they're pretty racist as well in their attitudes towards him. Is kind of more than you'd expect than the way he is as a private investigator in the novels, because, you know, he's quite accepted by the status quo in the books. There's one of many shots of him alone in his beautifully organised flat, but seen to be tortured, suffering, lonely, aging and feeling unloved because he doesn't have the same popular status as he had a few years before when he was a great detective. So this is a kind of, as you can see, even from the set and the look of it, I mean, it's not a great still there, but this is a set characterised by darkness and, as I said, kind of isolation and bleakness generally. Its worldview is pretty bleak. So this is an interesting adaptation, a million miles then from the kind of cozy feel of most Christie's works. Though actually, of course, the point about Christie is if you look beneath the surface, they're not that cozy after all. They just kind of pretend to be, and that's what Phelps was flagging up there. The other interesting aspect, and this has been seized on by critics of this 2018 adaptation, is that it deals with ideas about Brexit, and it explores the politics of Brexit just a couple of years after the UK decided to leave Europe. I'm still negotiating the torturous consequences. And of course, the right-wing press had a field day with this adaptation, as indeed they do with all Phelps's work. They don't really like her. The Daily Mail, for example, I always like to quote the Daily Mail just for the crack, really, but they turned the new Poirot story into an anti-Brexit propaganda by writers who have built in racial tensions that barely feature in the novel. And as always, the idea that it wasn't in the source is horrific to a lot of critics as well. But certainly, you know, it's not a major aspect of the novel, but the rise of fascism is a key theme in the adaptation. We kind of see the recurrent posters as a motif throughout. So we're exposed to see how a cultural hero, Poirot, is one of the most famous detectives in the world, the fictional detectives in the world, and yet he's the victim here of xenophobia, and we kind of see the way Britain is deeply problematic, and there's meant to be a clear parallel with contemporary Britain and its attitude towards people who've emigrated as well. So lots of debates in the kind of press about whether this was worthwhile or a good idea to add to the Poirot story, but it certainly added layers of complexity to someone who is kind of a cartoon defined in the books and in lots of adaptations, mostly by his moustache. Poirot was given a kind of deeper backstory. He's been a victim of Nazi invasions while he was in Brussels, and that's why, or sorry, while he's in Belgium, and that's why he's left. And we're kind of shown, and this is where the satire gets quite biting and the critique of Britain gets quite biting. The discrimination he experienced in modern Britain is just a continuation of a kind of the discrimination and the abuse that he received in his past, that he's fleeing from somewhere which is treats people terribly to get somewhere else that's just as bad. And so our own holding a mirror up to Britain's discrimination was quite biting here. But however, the source text does show us, I'm ruining it for you, and there are some spoilers as well as a couple of mentions of rape, which are just as a trigger warning at this point in the last few minutes of the paper. So the murderer does prove to be a central member of the British establishment. He is a member of the aristocracy. He's a typical Christie villain, you know, as well. And so the whole system of establishment of the UK is shown to be deeply corrupt and self-serving and nasty in lots of ways. So it isn't some random serial killer after all. It's indeed the most likely person and the would-be patriarch, and that's a theme which is common to Christie's work and which Phillips is really interested in exploring. The adaptation is also kind of fascinated by, and this is, you know, as a scholar period drama, that's where I'm interested in it as well, fascinated by the past and the present and the relationship between the two. And obviously it's a bit complicated because we are looking at an adaptation set in the 30s, but it's thinking about the 20s and it's kind of romanticizing the 20s because Poirot was alone and lonely and feels unappreciated and less famous now, but 10 years before, you know, he was at the height of his profession and he was a famous detective and everybody loved him. And this is the family that he becomes involved with and he visits in this adaptation has the same kind of ideas about things that happened 10 years earlier. So we see our characters as we look back and enjoy the period drama because of the costumes, you know, are always fabulous. The interiors are fabulous. Poirot's flat looks lovely, you know, as well. All these things we're enjoying and they are kind of doing the same about romanticizing their past as well. But of course, not as simple as that. Themes of disease and decay really run throughout this adaptation. The ABC Murders is kind of preoccupied with things like disease. We have, you can see her played by Tara Fitzgerald there on the right. We have Lady Hermione, who was a client or a friend of Poirot's there, hosting a glamorous 20s dinner party at the bottom right. But in the present day of the adaptation, she's dying of either TB or lung cancer. It's not clear. And there's kind of medical problems with the person framed for the crime as well. So I'm interested then in the way the past has become kind of corrupt and damaged and twisted, and it's partly to do with, you know, the way in which contemporary society views people like Poirot and treats them, really. And this is, of course, a really as you probably guessed from what I've just been saying, even if you haven't seen it, a really anti-heritage adaptation because we associate Christie with the country house, with the middle and upper class family. And of course, that's the setting for most of her works. But this adaptation chooses to focus a lot more on the poor and the sort of lower middle class kind of or lower who are working in London, which looks really grimy and horrible. at this point in the 30s. And one of the few times I've seen on TV a reference to in a period drama reference to bed bugs. That kind of annoys me always about period drama. They leave out all the fleas and the dirt and the bed bugs, and here we have like a bed that's situated in buckets of water because the bed bugs to stop them getting in. So it's kind of horrible, but it sort of feels real, and it's reminding us about the realities and the horribleness of the past. It isn't all tea on the lawn, to go back to that bit about Phelps, which she was criticised for a few minutes ago.
2 minutes.
And so basically most of the victims, they're not aristocratic, and they're basically treated as collateral damage by the murderer. But it's Poirot who cares, and he avenges them regardless, so we can see his kind of interest in the working class. He doesn't treat his victims differently. Okay, moving on to my final text briefly. The source text is about a cold case that's been reopened. And it's all kind of preoccupied with hereditary criminality and bad blood and that kind of thing. But the adaptation, this was again deeply controversial. This Radio Times ran a poll about whether it was a good idea or not, completely changed the ending. It changed the killer, and that's a step beyond if you're an Agatha Christie fan or a murder mystery fan. While retaining these ideas, as you can see there, there's a still of the dysfunctional family at the heart of it all. It wasn't moving forward there, and it should be a technical issue. And it's that ending I'm just going to kind of finish by talking about today. So it rewrites this story, which is, a kind of conventional cold case one, but as an exposure of sexual abuse. It brings in themes about rape, statutory rape, and children in care, because this story about a family who are adopted and the way that they're badly treated by their adopted parents after the war. And it ends as a scene, again, a warning of ruining for you. It ends as a rape revenge narrative, because the person who's committed the crimes is actually really punished for the statutory rape he committed years before, as much as he is for the murder. And there is the housekeeper, again, a rewriting of that Rebecca-like Hitchcock figure, the scary housekeeper. There she is, kind of in her moment of triumph, because she's been able to take her revenge upon him and lock him up and kind of, make him suffer as he has made her suffer. So again, rather than the murder being the kind of core of this, it becomes all about different social issues. So we had racism and the xenophobia in the previous one. Here it's kind of, the sexual kind of cover-ups that are institutionalized in all societies, but it was particularly pertinent, I suppose, for the BBC to be screening this kind of drama. So really the past then becomes a sort of place of abuse, or is shown as to be, as it so often was, a place of abuse. And in fact, rather than reveling in it, we should be really glad to leave it behind. And they also make us feel there's a lot of blood and guts and death and decay and illness in these adaptations, and they really make us feel the grimness of murder in the way that those source texts wanted us to forget. So they wanted us to see murder as an intellectual puzzle, but these are much more corporeal and make us really feel it. But they also, to kind of come back to the point that I started with, show us the ways in which these old-fashioned, kind of rigid, conservative formulas really are endlessly innovative. We have all those trappings of Christie. You can see the stately home there that I showed a minute ago, but actually really reworked in exciting new ways to show in which, that this is not just kind of stagnant, that actually it can lead to lots of exciting things. And there are just some of the inheritors of these Christie adaptations. You can see these recent films and TV shows borrow the ideas, some of them from Phelps, starting, because she was one of the first to do this in this exciting way. Knives Out is, of course, a classic Christie-esque movie that completely reworks the whole ideas about class and race in that portrayal of a toxic family and the death of the patriarch at the heart of it. But so it borrows from Christie, but it makes it a satire on modern Trump America, for example, as well. And High Seas and Murders in the Building make it comical and light-hearted, but still with social satire built in. So basically, Christie is still alive and well in those ways, and still lending herself to new possibilities, even though she's been adapted and continues to be, hundreds of times, but always fresh and exciting. Okay, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Katherine. Our next speaker is James Ward, who, like Katherine, is at Ulster University, and I just hand over to you. But I think, Katherine, you need to stop sharing for James to be able to share his screen. Great, thank you. Fabulous.
Sorry, I couldn't get my mic on there. Is that still sharing the PowerPoint?
It's yeah, it's now sharing the PowerPoint.
All right, okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, hi everybody, and thanks very much. I'm going to talk today about the belated admission of people of colour to main roles in television costume drama set in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I'm going to start with Gretchen Gersina's book Black London, Life Before Emancipation, which she published in the 1990s. When she was researching that book, she went into a bookshop in London and asked if they had any books on that topic, so the history of black people in pre-20th century England. And the reply she got from the shop assistant is probably one of the most passive-aggressive and ignorant remarks in history. Madam, there were no black people in England before 1945. Peter Freier's book, Staying Power, had already come out by that point, and that contains a very famous sentence in its opening chapter where it says that there were black people in England before there were English people. But for so long, as David Olusoga's recent book and TV series, Black and British, A Forgotten History, has pointed out, for so long, that has been a forgotten history. Academic study, historians like Olusoga and Gersina have made quite a significant contribution to undoing that forgetting. But it's only very recently, really, Olusoga's TV series, which tied in with this book, really is one of the first times we have seen that narrative or that discourse or those facts of history make it on to television. And so I'm particularly concerned with television drama in this paper here, and like Kate, particularly maybe a bit of an adaptation angle as well. Came first, I think, this wave of representation of people of colour from the pre-20th century past in cinema. This is Andrea Arnold's film of Wuthering Heights in 2012, which is the first English language screen representation of Heathcliff as a person of colour. Same era, kind of 2012, 2013, you had Belle, based, as it says there, on the inspiring true story of Dido Elizabeth Bell, a woman of colour, product of a union between a Navy officer and an enslaved woman who was brought and kept in the home of Lord Mansfield, as I'm sure many people know. And that film there is inspired by or even adapted from the portrait the historical portrait of Dido Bell, which has gone on to inspire even more adaptations as well. This is my favourite adaptation of all time. It is Peter Brathwaite's online project Rediscovering Black Portraiture, and that's him doing a cover version of Belle. So black lives from the pre-20th century past are beginning to circulate and proliferate on our screens at last, really. And this paper here, it's a much wider topic, but I'm going to look at television drama. And Gugu Mbatha Raw, who portrayed Belle in the film of that name, made a point that screen media were one of the last media to make that transition to representing those lives. So she said she could play Juliet, which she did with the Royal Shakespeare Company, but on film, she's talking about film on TV, there was more of a microscope of historical accuracy. So if she did, or if you did get to play a person of colour, as she said, it would usually be playing a slave or a character in a very subservient and brutalised role. And that, as of last 3 years, that has changed significantly. And there's, really two strategies through which that can be done. One is to latch on to some kind of element in a text that you might be adapting, which suggests that one of the characters might have been a person of colour, and Wuthering Heights is the example given there. Another one, this time on TV, is Sanditon, where Miss Lamb The young heiress is described as coming from the Caribbean, from the West Indies. So I think Sanditon is one show that does that. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about two other shows. This last part of the paper, I'll look briefly at Harlots. The very interesting drama based on the lives of sex workers, adapted or based around Hallie Rubenhold's book, Covent Garden Ladies. But first I'm going to look at the really unavoidable TV drama, which does this in a big and very interesting way, and that's Bridgerton. And I'm really, I know there's really interesting through lines and really interesting plot developments, but I'm really, in this paper, just kind of concerned with openings, entrances, coming out scenes, and really, I suppose, the argument of this opening part is really that these scenes are dramatising the admission of people of colour to the genre of period drama as much as they're dramatising a text or an original script. So opening scenes of Bridgerton, justly celebrated, have the Featheringtons and the Bridgertons getting ready to come out to be presented at court. And it's a very interesting world that you're inducted into there. You do see characters of colour out in the street, and then especially as the families are travelling to the palace, you see the footmen and the butlers and the people whose job it is to open doors or whatever. They're often people of colour, and they are silent in comparison with the very visible white characters who are kind of being put front and centre as the main characters of the drama at this point. And one of the authenticating strategies that Bridgerton uses to show you that somebody's a main character is to show you a portrait of them, show you a portrait before showing you them as an actor in the flesh. And so that's suddenly when we get the entrance of the Queen, we just have that strategy used. First of all, we see the portrait of Queen Charlotte, and then we see Charlotte herself. And suddenly we're aware that we are in quite a different televisual universe. As to what kind of universe Bridgerton is actually presenting us with, it's a very interesting question as to how exactly they are presenting the past and the presence of people of colour in that past. Like Gugu Mbatha Raw and Golda Roosevelt, who plays the Queen, Queen Charlotte in Bridgerton, says that this is a fundamental revolutionary shift in period drama. She talked about her exclusion from period drama. She talks about how this was a generational thing, how her mother was interested in it. And she says, we can rewrite that story. It's a very interesting, it's not really a metaphor because it's literally true. It's a very interesting turn of phrase to use in that kind of adaptation context. The cycle is stopping now. And I think that's a cycle of history as well as a cycle of representation. As to what Bridgerton is actually doing with history and with the historic presence of people of colour, as I said, is a really interesting question. And it kind of hedges its bets a good bit. I would say it kind of fuses or conflates multiple strategies. One of the things it's certainly doing is using that kind of gesture towards historical possibility, if not historical authenticity, by drawing on debate which started to circulate quite publicly a few years before Bridgerton came out. This article here, I think, is from 2015. The possibility that the consort of George III had possibly been a woman of colour was being viewed as a possibility by historians for a long time before that, but it really became public discourse, I suppose, in around about 2015-16. That's one thing that the show is doing, but it's maybe not the only thing that the show is doing. This one of the most widely quoted exchanges of TV from the last couple of years. You see it everywhere. It's the kind of expository dialogue between Lady Danbury and Simon Bassett, who says she's taken him on as her kind of protege, as you know, and she says to him, "Look at our Queen, look at our King. What happened there was love brought them together across the racial divide and kind of created the society that we live in." So as well as kind of historic gesture towards authenticity, there's a kind of an element here of counterfactual or alternate history here, and there's a lot of very good work about starting to use kind of terms from science fiction. Talk about Bridgerton, so there's articles about the quality of the world building in Bridgerton, which I thought was really, really interesting. But I think even in this short dialogue, you have kind of different possibilities here. You have the historical authenticity, the alternate history, but in Simon Bassett's riposte to Lady Danbury, you have something different again. Before Queen Charlotte became famous in terms of the kind of racialized discourse, her husband was much more famous for the ableism or Satanism with which his own mental health was presented. And Simon Bassett draws on that when he says, well, this was just a whim. We don't know technically what that means, really, what happened or what laws changed or what went on. But he said, he says this a whim from the king who can just as easily change his mind. As we all know, that's hanging on by a very loose and tenuous thread. So the third possibility there is that this is, almost a kind of a delusional fantasy, and it takes us into some quite dark territory. It's territory that Bridgerton abandons pretty quickly, but it is territory that is there. It's interesting, actually, going back through history to try and look for representations of royalty and aristocracy of people of colour on TV. One of the most interesting one is Gulliver's Travels, the famous Ted Danson, Jim Henson miniseries production from 1996, which shows the kingdom of Brobdingnag to be a black Baroque court in all its splendour. And the king of Brobdingnag, in the original text, he was a king. In this TV version, they are made female. And so there's lots of interesting kind of inversions going on here. And you can see the Ted Danson there is being held up on a chair by a footman. So the kind of moral stature of people of colour and white people is also reverse in that instance there, because Brobdingnag is the only society that Gulliver visits that's actually more civilized than his own, and one which he thinks, actually, sorry, it's one of two, but it's the only human society that he looks up to and thinks is almost better than his own. So I suppose that's really kind of the guts of what I want to say about Bridgerton, other than to just kind of think about where those ideas are coming from. One I've mentioned is Gulliver's Travels. Another is, well, I don't want to say high art, but things like the visual arts, things like stage drama, have been for a much longer period than TV, kind of playing around with ideas of racial authenticity and historical authenticity. One of the most interesting artists working in that field is Yinka Shonibari, and the picture here is from a video piece called Addio del Passato, which is an aria from Verdi's La Traviata, and in kind of Shonibari's rendering of that piece, the main female role is imagined to be sung by Frances Nisbet, who was the first wife of Lord Horatio Nelson. So the whole kind of military and naval conquest history is being evoked there as well. And she was from Caribbean as well. She was from Nevis, so Shonibari reimagines her as a person of colour as well. And you can see visually how what we're seeing in, for want of a better word, experimental video art here is becoming mainstreamed within 10 years on the TV show Bridgerton. The way Shonibari talked about his work was really interesting as well. He said there's elements of futurism in what he does as well. He says, I'm remaking the past for the future. It's never an historical document. It's always a kind of a fabrication, a mimicking and a parody. Certainly not accuracy, not accurate description. There's always poetic license. And I think it's really interesting to read that back into what's going on in Bridgerton. It is a kind of a fabrication. It has elements of parody in terms of its kind of self-referentiality and its kind of unwillingness almost to raise the subject of race. Particularly when a lot of discourse around the show, which I won't go into, often accused it of quite a lot of racial insensitivity. Katherine Byrne and Anne Taddeo have talked about this in their book Rape and Period Drama, about the way the character of Simon is depicted. Colorism is another criticism that's been made of Bridgerton as well. So it's it's fantasy, but it's not utopian. It's the kind of brief discussion of the question of race and then move on to kind of more fabulousness. It really does kind of raise some really interesting questions. It is, it's a kind of poetic license that Shonibari is talking about, and it's, as people will know, it's kind of endlessly fascinating and difficult to talk about in some ways. Okay, and just the last kind of element, I think, of thinking about Bridgerton as an adaptation, really is, when you are transforming or race lifting, to use a word, when you're kind of performing a race lift on certain characters, it can become very problematic when you think about how those characters are represented in the original text. So in the first Bridgerton book, before he arrives at the start of this novel back in England, Simon is described as having delved into the mysteries of North Africa and explored the West Indies. And it seems to be kind of coded reference to his kind of sexual exploits as well. So, there's a certain amount of white privilege in the original Simon, and a certain amount of licentious pleasure taken or hinted at being taken there as well. So it is very interesting, but as I say, quite difficult to talk about. So I'll just conclude this paper with a bit of discussion of another very interesting show, which is in some ways kind of more tied to notions of historical authenticity, and that's Harlots. So in series 1, episode 2, you have a confrontation between two main characters, just in the very, very edge of the shot there. That's the cheek of Margaret Wells, who runs one of the houses, two rival houses in the show. And here we have a woman who in the show is called Harriet Lennox, who would have been known historically by the offensive term Black Harriet. And we owe the knowledge of her historical existence to this text here, which is Nocturnal Revels, which was a guide to the brothels of London, written anonymously by a privileged man who used those brothels. So the challenge that Harlots set itself to take someone mentioned in those terms in a brothel gate and make them into a compelling and interesting and real character who's not kind of defined by their sexuality or by their ethnicity as they are in that original. One of the things thank you. Okay. One of the things the show does, really interestingly, is invert the kind of power play that you see in sex work. So in one of the scenes here, she comes down the stairs in a masquerade and uses the kind of whole dynamic of S&M to invert that whole power dynamic. So I'm just going to finish up now, again, by looking back at the original text. This is Hallie Rubenhold's The Covent Garden Ladies. Her source text here was a book called A Guide to Leaves the Covent Garden. She didn't look too closely at this book, and she has about half a sentence on Harriet, which Harlots extrapolates from in really interesting ways. In 2020, Rubenhold said, if I was writing this book again, I would write it very differently. And she says something really interestingly. 2005 is very different now, almost as much as from the late 18th century. She's talking there about gender and kind of about consent and issues like that, but I think you could very easily read that forward as being in terms of race and hopefully the new and interesting transformations that are taking place in period drama. And as I said at the start of this paper, they're not coming before their time. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Julie Anne Taddeo. Taddeo, sorry. I always get your name wrong.
That's okay. Okay, so can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Great. All right, thank you everyone for sticking around. It's much earlier where I am in the States, so I appreciate that. And thank you, Elke, for including our panel in your conference. All right, so the TV period drama A Place to Call Home follows the interclass relationships between the wealthy Bly family and the locals in the fictional country town of Inverness, New South Wales. Hailed as the Australian Downton Abbey when it aired in 2013, A Place to Call Home had solid ratings, critical acclaim, and a devoted fan base for 2 seasons. So when it was canceled by Channel 7, fans' outrage prompted another channel, Foxtel, to pick it up for 4 more seasons, ending in 2018. Today, it remains one of the most well-loved period dramas, reaching U.S. audiences on PBS and streaming sites like Amazon. Like most period dramas, A Place to Call Home targeted a largely female audience, with its storylines about cross-class love, women struggling to achieve personal and professional happiness in the post-war era, and domestic abuse and rape. And in fact, Kate and I use A Place to Call Home because it has a couple of really interesting rape plot lines. But today I'm focusing on a different aspect because multiple subplots showcase the plight of men and how they cope with a startling array of traumas, from the lasting effects of childhood emotional abuse to the brutality of gay conversion therapy, and even literal physical emasculation. In fact, every male character has some kind of trauma, so today is just a really small sample. The series interrogates post-war masculinity, an era in which men were expected to conform to rigid expectations of stoicism and heteronormativity. But its storylines of male trauma also engage with 21st century concerns and controversies, some which are specific to Australia and some which are not. In the final season of the series, the local doctor, Jack Duncan, this is this guy in the hat here, he was a former POW and a recovering alcoholic, and he forms a men's group to, quote, get blokes talking, not just to help men like himself heal, but to put a stop to the toxic masculinity to which several of the female characters have been subjected. Thus, the series suggests the power of period drama TV to be a space in which masculinity can be explored, critiqued, and even transformed, not just for its characters, but for its viewing audience. In an interview about the series' popular success, actor Dave Barry, who plays James Bligh, right here, noted, "I hope that if someone were to visit this country and to ask, what are some things that represent this country culturally, this TV series would be something you would give them to watch and understand what Australia is all about." The series creator, Bevan Lee, added that he wanted to write a show that paid tribute to his parents' generation, the men and women who lived through the ordeal of the Second World War, and then returned home to try to deal with the legacy of trauma from that experience as they headed into the prosperity of the 1950s. While many of the storylines are rooted in Australian history specifically, some are much more universal, and perhaps this explains the appeal to UK and US audiences who've made this show an international success. As in the US and the UK, post-war Australian society was built around a white middle-class nuclear patriarchal family. But most of the male characters in the series are unable to achieve this ideal of masculinity expected of them. Even male characters who seem to be in positions of power, the wealthy family patriarch, right here, George Bligh, and his son and heir James, for example, are all men in crisis. In short, they're men who often don't feel that they have their own place to call home. So let me just give you a little recap of what the series is about in general. So Sarah Adams, right here, is a survivor of a German concentration camp. And she meets the wealthy Bligh family of Ash Park, Inverness, while she's nursing on a ship sailing from England to Australia in 1953. She bonds with the widower, George Bligh, right here. And she treats his mother, who's this very imposing figure, Elizabeth, for heart disease. She has a slight attack on the ship. And one evening, Sarah stops George's son, James, who we learn is a closeted homosexual, traveling with his English bride, Olivia, and he's about to throw himself overboard. When the voyage comes to an end, James's grandmother insists that his secret not be revealed to Sarah. So she has no idea why he attempted suicide, because Sarah, she says, is an outsider, even as James's feelings of guilt and shame are clearly taking a toll on his marriage and his health. Now, during the 1950s, Australian psychoanalysts and psychiatrists attempted to cure homosexuals rather than imprison them, and thus return them to the heterosexual social order. In addition to chemical castration, there was gay conversion therapy with insulin comas, lobotomies, electroconvulsive therapy, antipsychotic drugs, and induced vomiting, most of which are practiced on James Bligh when he commits himself to a clinic so that he can be the husband and father his family expects of him. He does this when he learns that his wife is pregnant and he feels that now he has to cure himself. While such treatments were largely discontinued by the medical profession in the 1970s, when homosexuality was decriminalized in Australia, Gordon Elke Young has demonstrated in our new book, I'll put a plug for that, about diagnosing history. So he explores this in much greater detail. So Gordon Elke Young has shown that religious organizations were still promoting these types of treatment as late as the 2010s. And in 2018, members of Australia's Liberal Party tried to actually legislate to allow this therapy for children. Fortunately, they failed. Now, the hospital scenes involving James's treatment are very graphic, likely difficult for viewers to watch. They're difficult for me. So they are probably, hopefully, rooting for James's rescue, as the doctor treating him repeatedly lies to his wife and father that James is comfortable and well looked after. And he is indeed rescued just in time before his scheduled lobotomy. And this is only after Sarah chides George. They're actually engaged at this point. And she chides him about his revulsion over his son's sexuality. Initially, when he learned about it, he wished James dead. And she compares George to the Nazis who tortured such men in the very camp where she, a Jewish woman, was herself imprisoned during the war. This reminder by Sarah of such a dark part of history compels not just George, but viewers to take a side. Do they wish to side with evil or show compassion? James's wife, Olivia, had previously told her father-in-law that he should be ashamed of himself for not loving his son as he is. And the message of acceptance is repeated throughout the series as other gay characters are introduced. For example, when the town gossip Doris Collins here spies the farmhand Harry kissing the surgeon Henry Fox, she receives a bit of an education from Roy Briggs. He's like this alpha male farmer who's respected by the entire town. And he tells her that God wouldn't have made such blokes if he thought they were abnormal. Those who refuse to accept them, who call these fellow residents of Inverness filth, as they are called by a couple of characters, these are the villains who gay bash and almost kill Harry in an earlier episode. And it's their values that are at odds with those promoted by this series. In a fit of anger, Sarah even likens Doris to the Nazis. She does this a lot when people challenge her. And this further prompts Doris's rejection of her earlier homophobia, and she comes to accept these men. Now, these episodes were filmed in the midst of an ongoing campaign to legalize gay marriage in Australia in the late 2010s. Actor Dave Barry, in the role of James Bly, acknowledged what he called the unapologetically political message at the heart of the series. The creator, Bevan Lee, added, "I wanted to nudge people to examine the inequities and prejudices of now through the prism of the past." Other cast members actively campaigned for the law's passage, talking directly to their fan base on social media. They did TikTok and YouTube videos, and they were posing with rainbow flags. And as Ellie Young has documented, the main demographic for this series, the age 55s and over, actually overwhelmingly voted in favor of legalizing gay marriage. Now, I'm not saying that it's mainly because of this series, but it does show the power of these types of very popular TV shows, where they show an oppressive past to help enact change in the present. And the emotional power as well cannot be ignored. Dave Barry, again, the actor who played James, he said that he heard from so many older gay men who had lived through this time that they saw presented on their screens. But he also heard from many younger men who told him that the series helped them accept who they are, even if their families would not. Now, James's story arc, from internalized shame and medical torture to familial and self-acceptance, is accompanied by his father's doubts about his own masculinity. So James Bly, the patriarch. In a much later episode, George Bly, we come to understand George's prejudices about James and how they're tied to his own youthful trauma and guilt. And that he actually sees what everyone praises as his sensitivity. He's told time and time again by the women how sensitive he is. He comes to see it as his weakness that is linked to his past. Now, we learn through flashbacks that George's father, Lewis Bly, the original Bly patriarch, was an athlete, and he had always made headlines as a rugged outdoorsman. So he's disgusted by his bookish son, George. He's determined to teach George to be a man, as he tells him. And in one scene, this flashback, he tries to force his teen son to have sex with the prostitute that he's hired to initiate his son into manhood. So when the teenage George discovers his father in the barn with another man, he tells him he's disgusting. This prompts his father to strike him and then demand that George, his son, hit him back before the father rides off to his death. Over the years, George has wondered if it was an accident, as everyone says, that the father had been thrown from the horse. Or was it a suicide prompted by his son's reaction? And the guilt has eaten away at George until now, in the present, he confesses to his elderly mother, Elizabeth. And then he learns that she, in fact, had known about her husband's homosexuality all along. Nevertheless, he's been blaming himself for never being good enough for him. I was never manly enough. So Elizabeth, his mother, who's been so determined to keep her grandson James's sexuality a secret, as well as that of her husband's, consoles him and finally realizes how silence has been what's been hurting the men in her family all along. Another male character who initially struggles with accepting James is the country doctor Jack Duncan. Jack weds James's Aunt Carolyn, who is considered the most progressive of the Blythes. She lives what her mother calls a bohemian lifestyle in the city, surrounding herself with artists, which is code for gay men and women. And we learn in a later episode that Carolyn once had a lesbian lover herself. Carolyn and Jack, we learn, when they were teenagers, they had a brief affair, and it produced actually a daughter. And they've reconnected now in early middle age. She's constantly urging Jack to set his sights beyond a country hospital. But it's Sarah, the camp survivor who works as his nurse, who recognizes how trauma has trapped Jack in place, that the safety of a small community is what's keeping him from confronting his demons, as they call it. And Jack's demons are pretty huge. We learned that he has been literally emasculated as a POW in a Japanese camp. He was tortured, as he says, my balls crushed by the Japs, and now he takes testosterone. Carolyn knows the specifics of his torture after his initial reluctance to be intimate in the bedroom because he fears he won't be man enough for her. And so he feels the need to assert his manhood in other ways. So, for example, after Carolyn is raped by her employer, the newspaper baron, Sir Richard, Jack insists on confronting him, even though she reminds him, "It happened to me." And in reply, he says he refuses to be gutless. And so he challenges her rapist, Sir Richard, to a duel with fisticuffs, as we see in this scene. Later, when he catches his wife about to kiss another woman from her past, he laments, "It's bad enough the Japs cut my balls off. The woman I love did it all over again." Blaming Carolyn for castrating him all over again is an easy out for Jack. Again, it's Sarah who he often goes to for comfort. They have this bond, this war trauma bond. She had been tortured at Ravensbrück, and so she's the one who's able to comfort him. But the interesting thing about Jack's trauma is that it does make him a better doctor to his predominantly female patients at his clinic. They adore him, again, for what they call his sensitivity and for taking their concerns seriously. On multiple occasions, he and Sarah treat victims of domestic abuse, and he warns the perpetrators that they'll have him to deal with. Real men don't beat up women. So I think this is also a way for him to assert his masculinity, that he'll be the defender of these women against their abusive husbands. And this is, though, a timely message. Recent studies while the series aired showed that domestic abuse was so pervasive in Australian society, with 1 out of every 3 Australian women reporting that they had been victims of domestic violence. Now, of course, in the series, the abusers ignore Jack, countering it's their right to do as they please with their wives. But it's after one abusive husband, Stan, who's so enraged by Sarah and Jack's interfering in his marriage that he actually has a stroke when he confronts them. So this is when Jack decides that the men of Inverness need to learn other ways of dealing with anger, not by taking it out on their wives, not by fighting each other, and not with alcohol, as he is used, but through talking it out. So he has a flyer for his men's group that he creates to Roy Briggs, which is the alpha male farmer here. And Roy laughs. He says, "Blokes talking?" And Jack replies, "Stranger things have happened." And to his surprise, after the initial meeting where no one turns up, he does get a full house, and the men start to talk about war, not just the past World War, but wars that they continue to fight within themselves, what it takes and what it does to them, as they say. And even Stan, who's weakened by his stroke and no longer a physical threat to his wife, joins the group, saying it's what his wife wants for Christmas. And the men welcome him, suggesting that no one is beyond redemption and change. Now, these abusive husbands, and there's several of them in the series, they are men who feel disempowered. They exist on the margins of the economy, they're failed breadwinners, and hence they take it out on their wives. But the most powerful men in this series, men like Lewis Bly, who we see in flashbacks, and the newspaper baron, Sir Richard, who raped Carolyn, they prove to be the most toxic of all. Sir Richard in particular seems modeled on men who we've all been familiar with in the late 2010s, men like Weinstein and Trump. Sir Richard takes what he wants, he blames the women he assaults for being whores, and when he's called out on his behavior, he demeans the men who defend them. After Jack beats him up to avenge Carolyn's rape, Sir Richard plots his own revenge. When Jack runs against George Bly to be MP of Inverness, Sir Richard interrupts his stump speech and reveals Jack's secret to the whole town. Waving documentary evidence, he asks the crowd, do you want a man with courage, a man with balls, or do you want a eunuch? Then, if you want the eunuch, you vote for Jack Duncan. He does this really much in the vein of someone like Trump mocking war heroes who got caught. Sir Richard's revelation of Jack's most closely guarded secret temporarily drives him back to drink. But no one at the rally sides with Sir Richard or laughs at Jack. They still see him as a war hero. So they boo Sir Richard, and George, who has never raised a fist to anyone, knocks him down, while the other men of the town throw food at Sir Richard and drive him out of Inverness. As Jack learns, and as George and James before him have learned, keeping the secret is what proves most harmful to these men and fuels their trauma. But it's Jack's relationship with another war veteran that we meet, which really proves to be the turning point for him in handling his trauma and learning that war actually is not a universal experience. And this is an important lesson for him too, but definitely one that's shaped by race. So in a later season of the series, we meet the Aboriginal war vet, Frank Gibbs. He's already told Elizabeth Bly that her philanthropic refuge for war veterans is a noble cause, but not one in which he'll be welcome. He's already had his home burned down by town bullies, and he explains to Elizabeth a piece of history of which she and maybe many viewers are unfamiliar. How men like him were told to fight for Australia and then returned with no pension and no commemoration for their service. This is a fine establishment, he tells her, but for white folk soldiers. We live in two different countries. This point is further driven home by a commemoration of Anzac Day in the episode set in 1958, 4 decades after the end of World War I. And we learn actually that this is a war too that someone, Frank Gibbs, or not Frank Gibbs, but Roy Briggs had been involved in. So, all the men have experienced war in some way. Anyway, at the time that this episode aired, about 1958, viewers would have been commemorating the centenary of that same war in what the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, heralded as the People's Celebration. Frank Gibbs' presence at the event is important because it reminds us that it would be another 10 years, 1968, for a referendum that would recognize Aboriginal Australians as equal to whites. So these storylines about war, PTSD, and the uneven treatment of veterans clearly have a political and social agenda. After a campfire chat with Frank, in which the two men share their trauma and cry, Jack in the series finale plans to revisit the scene of his wartime torture, telling his wife, Carolyn, it's time I face it head on and examine the wounds. And this is what the series prompts its audience to do as well about their own nation's history, at a time when the Australian government, like the US and the UK, have been engaging in what the media has dubbed education wars to promote a more conservative version of the history curriculum in schools that often writes these stories out of history. So to conclude, after World War II, the Australian government declared that the country would become the land of tomorrow, even though the anti-Aboriginal sentiments, the homophobia, and the sexism that this series critiques really belies that image. The series, though, ends with a flash forward to the future of all of its characters. We see Jack Duncan receive an Order of Australia for his services to rural medicine. Henry and Harry are in their 90s, but they finally legally marry in 2018, after the very law that the series cast campaigned for was passed. Sadly, though, James Bly, we learned, died of AIDS in 1986, a victim to a culture of silence. And his father, George, died at age 80, his whole life proof that decency is not a weakness. The series thus shows us what tomorrow could and should be, a tomorrow in which heteronormative masculinity is not idealized, but instead exposed as a source of trauma and suffering of both its male and female characters. It's a tomorrow, though, that can be made possible by the simple, yet sometimes frightening prospect of blokes talking. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That leaves us a lovely 23 minutes for questions. So I would like to hand over to the audience. obviously, as always, you can raise your hand via the reactions, or you can post in the chat. Christine?
Okay, thank you very much for it was a panel right up my street. So thank you. I just wanted to make a connection between the period drama that the three of you have been talking about, particularly Julie and James, perhaps, and the tropes of soap opera, which I think in some ways enable some of these things that you're talking about to actually happen in the period dramas. So that, Julie, I think the stories, the narratives, and indeed the message that you're, oh God, what's it called? I watched it religiously. No Place Like Home. A Place to Call Home. A Place to Call Home. You know, that story of that it's better to talk and that secrets are always problematic is a soap opera thing. And I think that, so the audience watching the programme will be familiar probably with those kind of storylines, if not necessarily in a period drama like this. And similarly, I think with the diversity, soap operas have much more diverse sets of characters. They have offered much more opportunities to actors of colour before period drama began to rather tentatively sort of join in. And again, I think that gives the audience something to work with. It's familiar, seeing these kind of actors, even if not necessarily in these shows. And that takes me right up to Kathleen's talk, because Sarah Phelps, of course, was a writer for EastEnders, and and that's where Tony Jordan, found her, adopted her, pushed her forward, and she wrote Oliver Twist in 27, which has Sophie Okonodo playing Nancy. Now, obviously not an aristocrat as in Bridgerton, but nevertheless the heroine of the drama, and one who is actually not abused in quite the way in which some Nancys are. And so, Kathleen, I really like those Christie adaptations, and I thought in particular about one of the things that strikes me is that one of the qualities of Phelps's writing is a directness, where characters say what they mean quite a lot, particularly about their emotions. And I think that's coming from EastEnders, where people are always saying what they mean. But I think particularly of Witness for the Prosecution, where right at the end of that, the two people who have committed the crimes, the murders, turn on members of the older generation, this is post First World War, and say, you made us like we are. You took away our lives. You robbed us of our possibilities. And it's the most direct statement. It's real melodrama. Good and evil are being positioned and complicated. So I think these are really interesting papers. But as I say, I think that part of it is about a genre crossover, if you like, that enables some of these issues to appear in period dramas in this way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Really, really interesting. I'm away to look at that adaptation of Oliver Twist. Definitely to watch that next. Thank you.
Do you want to respond in more detail?
I would say no, absolutely. It's true. I mean, it's very similar. This is the Australian Downton Abbey, and they had a few similar plots. They have the rape plot line, revenge scenarios regarding rape. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I grew up watching soap operas. My first memory is watching General Hospital, that my mother used to put me in a playpen because I was one of 8 children. Yes, but General Hospital did such really radical work. Did the first aid storyline. It had multiple rape storylines. And so while that's not period, the thing with shows like Downton Abbey and A Place to Call Home is because there are multiple seasons, we can see what happens to these characters when these things happen to them. The story can play out and we're invested in them. I think, combining soap and the, more traditional elements of period drama is so important. It pulls in viewers, and I do think a lot of women viewers like myself. But at the same time, you are seeing some actually really important work being done. It's getting people aware about these issues, for instance, about Australian history and the need to tell these stories, whether they're personal or political, and obviously they're both.
And absolutely, and we noticed, didn't we, Julie, when we were writing about rape, that we've got a chapter on male rape, and it was still kind of an unusual thing to see on television, and period drama started to engage with that. But of course, soap opera had already done it. Where you'd seen it on TV before, where it was in the soaps. So it just shows it's always kind of ahead of the curve and borrowing from anything else. But I wanted to ask you in return. I mean, I thought Sarah was trying to get away from her soap origins because they're so deliberately arty, some of these adaptations. Sometimes that's not the most successful thing about them, and maybe she is better to, the dialogue and stuff that she does, she's comfortable with. But there's lots of kind of techniques where she's trying to make it look art housey, and there's and it's kind of, but it didn't seem to be working for me. But I thought maybe she's trying to leave her soap behind and move into something else, or she thinks period drama has to do a certain thing. Do you know what I mean? I'm thinking of like the motif of the ticking clock and the blood spots. In Ordeal, for instance, for example, doesn't, she's trying to experiment a little bit, but don't know if it quite works.
You're muted, Christine.
Yes, thank you. I'll have a think about that. I don't know the later ones so well. I mean, she does talk about writing very interestingly. She participates there's a BBC Writers' Room website which she contributes to, and I have heard her in the days pre-COVID. I have heard her speak, and the thing that strikes me about her is that she's very bold. So if she's going to go arty or to emphasize the period side of it, then she does it in quite a dramatic, underlined way, which of course doesn't necessarily suit audiences who prefer to have a more refined approach to Jane Austen or Dickens or whatever it is. So I'm not sure that she would feel that she has to do that because it's period drama, but more that she wants to experiment with that and see whether the boldness of her previous writing. I mean, do you know Dickens? Sorry, I shouldn't do this, but do you know Dickensian, which she wrote? She wrote 2, I think, or 3 episodes of that, which are about childbirth. And they are the most graphic representations of childbirth that you're likely to see on popular television. Right. So I think when she wants to do something, she really does it very boldly.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I don't know that. I don't know it actually, but thank you.
Oh, it's so much fun. It's brilliant. And the whole backstory of Miss Havisham, I appreciated that so much because I feel that she's such a misunderstood Dickens character.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Mita, you had your hand up briefly.
All I was going to say, in addition to Christine's earlier comment, was about a place called Home. That was shown in the daytime in the UK, from what I remember, because I came to it quite late. And Julie said something about like the trauma of James's conversion. So I don't know how, because that's quite soap opera-y, scheduling it in during kind of daytime. It was like 2:00 in the afternoon during the week. To me, that's very kind of old school kind of soap opera scheduling time. A little bit anyway. But then there was also these, like, I didn't watch it whilst James was going through his conversion. I think I joined it much later. So I don't know how, if it was quite traumatic. I do wonder how that was kind of represented on the BBC when it is, a daytime schedule. So, like, I think that was all I wanted to add, was that the schedule in the UK was quite different maybe to what it was in Australia or elsewhere. Yeah, sorry, that was all.
No, that's interesting. I want to look into that. At the time that was on, though, it was the same year that Downton Abbey did its attempt at a gay conversion plot with the Thomas Barrow, when he sends away for the find your own path cure, and then he ends up getting ill from the unsterile needles. And then later he tries to attempt suicide. So these plots were on at the same time, as well as Call the Midwife, which I do think airs in the evening, right, in the UK. They had a gay conversion when one of the midwives' patients, her husband is arrested in a public urinal, and he has to choose between prison or chemical castration. So I think that the plot was really hot for a while too in the later 2010s. But that is interesting that it was during the day, but it was in the evening in Australia, that I know.
I'm going to use my chair privilege to ask James a question. We had Kirsten Warner last year talking about Bridgerton, and she was not massively positive about it. But what struck me was she was pointing to kind of the oral elements of television in order to narrate Black history. And when she was talking, she reminded me very strongly, but I don't know if she had seen it or if indeed you have seen it, The Long Song, which, you know, is, I think one of my students once calls slavery stories like another trauma story, another Black trauma stories, because that's obviously one of the issues when you represent the history of the Black experience in relation to British colonialism. But the Long Song is I think it's a very empowering story, because obviously, you know, it ends with the success of the Black people and the whites leaving. So I don't know, I was just wondering if you could maybe say something about that.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think I would certainly share some of the problems with Bridgerton. I think it's ingenious, but I don't say the word gimmick, but you know, there is that inclusion of diversity and attempt to kind of rationalize it, and then it sort of gets forgot about. And then we have the Two Sisters from India in series 2, and again, it suggests something very interesting. You know, people from India who are aristocrats in 18th century England. That's actually a really interesting plot possibility, but it gets forgot about. So yeah, I think the long song is in many ways much more interesting, much more nuanced, much more sensitive, and the original novel is a great novel to teach as well. But Bridgerton is the one everybody's talking about. You know.
Do we have any further questions?
I would plug in for High Seas, which Kate only alluded to at the end. If you like soap opera, I think Spanish soap operas and period dramas are so wonderful. There is a virus subplot in the second season, which will feel a little too timely, but it was filmed before COVID. But it has Agatha Christie elements and rape, of course, which features just in about every period drama. But I do think it's worth your time.
Great. If no one else has a question, oh no, Mita has a question. Go for it.
Yes, I do. As audiences, and I'm going to make an assumption here that all the speakers are white, you identify as white. How do you feel about seeing people of colour in these period dramas? And also, has anyone watched The Cook of, what was it called? It's a Spanish costume drama on Netflix. That's quite interesting take on it as well. Was it The Cook of Castamere or something it's called? And that's got a kind of a key Black character in it as well. It's like he's like an adopted aristocratic son in it. And there's attempts to get him sold back into slavery as well. That's quite an interesting what as white audiences, how are you feeling? How do you read as an audience member, not as an academic, as an audience, the different races being represented in period drama? And thank you all for your papers as well. They were really great.
So thank you for that question. Is it okay if I go first? Because I listened in, you might be familiar if you follow her on Twitter, Amanda Ray Prescott. She's a freelance journalist and she writes about the fandom and the issue of racism. And so she actually did a call in last night and people could participate because she's discovered there's a lot, especially among Austinites who don't like these modern adaptations that have, colorblind and color conscious casting. I thought Sanditon season 2 was really great, the way that they actually addressed the sugar boycotts and the slave trade. And it's hard for me because I am a historian, so I watch as a fan. And I mean, as long as they're beautiful and they keep me watching, I don't care. But I do take issue with Bridgerton because there is that history there. They're all eating these sweets and nobody's talking about what some even fashionable members of the town would have done. They would have been taking part in a sugar boycott. And so that whole history of slavery and abolition is just, it's washed out. And having the two sisters, Kate and Edwina, but no one's talking about the East India Company, but they have a conversation about tea. So it does bug me because it's a lost opportunity. But in terms of everything else, I mean, I think about everything we've watched in the past. And if you watch Shakespeare plays, like, why are people getting all up in arms when the actors are more diverse? I mean, it's just, it is annoying. And I do think there is an element of racism among the fandom. So I find it upsetting.
Who wants to go next?
I can go second if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I suppose the first thing I was thinking about saying was, oh, well, I can't separate myself as an academic from somebody who watches TV. Every time I watch something, I'm just thinking, oh, write that down. But actually, I suppose why I fixated on Harlots and Bridgerton in particular is because I suppose, as a white bloke in his 40s, like, I have that kind of thing where, drama has to be kind of real and gritty and not fabulous. I think Kate used two words. She said, tension between the fabulous and the horrible, and I'd be very much for the horrible. So that's why I love Harlots, actually, because I thought it had done that brilliantly. I actually surprisingly liked Bridgerton a lot more than I felt I should have, because I liked the fabulousness, and I was very frustrated at the way it raised difficult issues, as Julie is saying, and then sort of, oh, well, here's some more dresses. And I thought Belle was actually great that way as well. That's enough for me. I think that's why I felt.
Yeah, I suppose, like Julie, I'm a bit frustrated because, as a feminist, again, I can't really leave that out of being a fan. But, I think Peer Jam has done amazing stuff for women. It really feels like it's sold us all on feminism and rewritings, and no matter how bad they are, they've always got really good, positive feminist messages. But they haven't yet done the same for race and racial issues, and that's still kind of, and Bridgerton, James and I have talked about this, but it kind of, because it just does it and then it leaves it, it feels like we're just forgetting all about that. We could just take that as granted, and I don't think that's true. You can't take any of these issues for granted. So I sort of felt Bridgerton, it's like a post-feminist TV show that's saying, oh, these issues are solved now because we've just amalgamated, these diverse characters into our society. And that's, in some ways, that's worse, but then it's not worse because at least they're there, so it's not really an answer, but just a few thoughts. But yeah, thank you.
And I want to add to that, Kate, because we were able to cover the scene in Bridgerton in our book, with the lack of consent, that scene, which I know is really problematic. It was even worse in the book. But I have to say that season 2 seems to have learned, because I think this is an important issue too that enough people aren't talking about. The original source texts, yeah, they're written in the early 2000s, but I'm reading them all now, and I am struck by kind of how sexually violent all the relationships are. The men are always grabbing and bruising and pushing and even stepping on Kate's hand, right? And I'm supposed to accept that as romantic. And I think season 2 has erased like all of that from the books. And the scene when Anthony and Kate finally get it on and he says, should I stop? And she clearly gives consent and wants to go ahead. And I think they failed in the first season. I think they could have just rewritten that scene even in a better way that they did. But I think those issues too about sex, consent, we're still period drama still has work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you for answering the question.
Christine, did you want to come in again for a final question?
Well, I just think one of the issues is about in theatre, we are very used to actors being cast without noticing the colour. So, you know, they're in Shakespeare and it doesn't matter what colour, ethnicity they are. And that's a convention in theatre. But that convention is much more difficult on television, I think. And so in Bridgerton, I think tries to have it both ways. On the one hand, what does it matter that you've got all these wonderful actors, you know, that look beautiful and wear stunning dresses, etc. It doesn't matter the colour. But then they make the claims about Queen Charlotte being black and, oh, it's all historically accurate. And I think those are two different strategies. So when Nancy is played by Geoffrey Okonodo, that's colourblind casting. But in Bridgerton, there's different things going on, and I think it gets a bit muddled. And I think it is genuinely quite difficult. But we don't have a clear account, as we do if you go to the theatre. You know you aren't meant to notice that Hamlet is black unless the production tells you to, and most of the time it doesn't.
That's a good point. I'm afraid, if you don't mind, because I have to get my own daughter and son, so I'm a bit pressed for time. Can I ask everyone to just thank the speakers again for a really interesting afternoon session, which I, for one, really enjoyed. Period drama is also right up my street, even though I don't write about it, but I love watching it. So, yeah. And thank you for all the questions, and we will see you tomorrow at I think tomorrow we start at 10. Let me just double check. Sorry, I am a bit disorganized. Yes, tomorrow we start at 10 o'clock with a history and television panel, so I hope to see some of you then. Julie, please stay in bed.
Thank you.
Bye. See you later.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.